In all his years of television, Steve Harvey had never heard silence like that. Not the kind that waits for a punchline. Not the kind that holds its breath before applause. This was different. This was the kind of silence that makes a studio feel small, that turns 1,000 strangers into witnesses of something they weren't prepared to see. The kind that reminds you that beneath all the lights and cameras and carefully timed commercial breaks, there are still moments too sacred to script. It happened in the middle of an ordinary taping. The audience had been laughing just seconds before belly laughs, the kind Steve had spent decades perfecting, the kind that make people forget their troubles for a minute or two. The contestants were loose, comfortable, playing the game the way it was meant to be played. Everything was running like clockwork. Another episode, another show, another night of families hoping to win money, hoping to create a memory they could take home and tell their friends about. But then, something shifted. Steve was mid-question, his card in hand, that signature grin spreading across his face as he prepared to read the next prompt. The kind of moment he'd orchestrated 10,000 times before. He opened his mouth to speak, and that's when the voice came from the crowd. Not loud, not demanding attention, just clear, steady. The kind of voice that's learned how to carry weight without raising volume. Mr. Harvey. 2 words. That's all it took for everything to stop. Steve's head turned. The cameras swung. The audience, mid-laugh just heartbeats ago, went still. Because there was something in that voice, something that wasn't asking for a favor or trying to be funny. Something that sounded like it had traveled a long way to get here. Something that knew what it cost to speak. The man was standing now. You could see him rising from his seat in the 3rd row, and even from a distance, even under the hot studio lights that wash out so many details, you could see the uniform. You could see the way he stood straight, solid, like a tree that's weathered every storm and refused to bend. And you could see, if you looked close enough, the way his hands were trembling just slightly at his sides. Steve Harvey, for maybe the first time in 40 years of broadcasting, didn't have a word ready. He just stood there, microphone lowered, eyes locked on the man in uniform, and the entire studio held its breath. The game didn't matter anymore. The scoreboard might as well have been invisible. Even the cameras, trained to capture every reaction, every tear, every gasp, seemed to understand that what was about to happen wasn't meant for ratings. It was meant for something else entirely. The soldier took a step forward. The aisle suddenly felt like the longest distance in the world. Every eye in the room followed him. You could hear his boots against the floor. You could hear someone in the back row whisper, "Oh my God." You could hear Steve Harvey's breath catch, just for a second, in a way that told you he knew he already knew that this wasn't a moment he'd forget. And somewhere in that silence, before anyone spoke another word, before the story unfolded and the tears came and the truth finally found its way into the light, there was a question hanging in the air that everyone was asking, but no one dared to say out loud. What does a soldier need to say so badly that he'd stop a show to say it? His name was Marcus Webb, 32 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan, a bronze star tucked away in a drawer somewhere back home because he never felt right displaying it. The kind of man who signed up the week after his 18th birthday, not because he was running from something, but because he believed, truly believed, that service meant something. That protecting people you'd never meet was the highest calling a person could answer. But tonight, standing in that aisle, under lights that felt too bright and too hot, Marcus wasn't thinking about medals or tours, or the things he'd seen overseas that still woke him up at 3 in the morning. He was thinking about a promise. The kind you make when someone's looking at you with eyes that trust you completely, the kind that burrows into your chest and lives there, waiting for the day you finally keep it. Steve Harvey lowered his microphone slowly, instinctively, like a man who'd spent enough years reading rooms to know when the script needed to be thrown out entirely. He took 2 steps toward the edge of the stage, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than anyone in that audience had ever heard it. "Son," Steve said, "what's your name?" "Marcus Webb, sir. Sergeant Marcus Webb. Sergeant Webb." Steve nodded, and you could see something shift in his expression. The comedian stepping back, the man stepping forward. "You got something you need to say?" Marcus's jaw tightened. For a second, it looked like the words might not come. Like maybe standing up had taken all the courage he had, and now he was stranded here in front of cameras and strangers with nothing left to carry him through. But then he glanced to his right, just for a heartbeat, and when he looked back at Steve, His eyes were wet. "There's someone here," Marcus said, his voice steady but strained, like a rope pulled tight. "Someone who doesn't know I'm here. Someone who saved my life. And I never got to say thank you." The studio went impossibly quieter. People leaning forward in their seats now, phones forgotten, breath held. Steve Harvey stood perfectly still. "Who is it?" Steve asked. Marcus pointed. "Row 7. Seat 12. A woman, mid-50s maybe, with gentle eyes and hands folded in her lap like she was sitting in church. She'd been smiling before, laughing at Steve's jokes, having the kind of night people save up vacation days for. But now she was frozen, her face a mixture of confusion and something else, something that looked like the beginning of recognition, like a memory trying to surface after years underwater. "Her name is Patricia Coleman," Marcus said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the name. "And 10 years ago, she was a nurse at Walter Reed Medical Center. I was 19. I'd just come back from my first deployment, and I was." He paused, swallowed hard. "I was in a bad place. Real bad. The kind of bad where you start thinking the world might be better off without you in it." You could hear it now, the sharp intake of breath from 100 people at once. Patricia's hand moved to her mouth. "I don't know if she remembers me," Marcus continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "It was just one night. I was just one soldier out of thousands she probably saw. But she sat with me for 4 hours. She didn't have to. Her shift was over. She could have gone home. But she stayed. She talked to me about her son, about baseball, about stupid things that didn't matter except they did, because they reminded me that life was more than the things I couldn't forget." Patricia Coleman was crying now, tears streaming down her face as her hands trembled against her cheeks. And even though she hadn't said a word yet, you could see it in her eyes. She remembered. She remembered all of it. Steve Harvey's voice was barely a whisper. "And you never got to thank her?" "No, sir," Marcus said. "I shipped out 2 days later, went back for my second tour, and I looked for her after. I swear I did, but I never found her. Until tonight. Until I saw her sitting right there, laughing at your jokes like any other person, and I just..." He couldn't finish. Didn't need to, because Patricia Coleman was already standing. Sometimes, the distance between two people is measured not in feet or rows, or the space between strangers in a crowded room, but in years, in sleepless nights, in questions that never got answered, and gratitude that never found its voice. And as Patricia Coleman, a woman in her mid to late 50s with a gentle maternal presence, light to neutral skin tone, soft facial features with fine wrinkles around her eyes, warm hazel or brown eyes, shoulder-length chestnut, brown hair with slight gray strands styled in loose natural waves, wearing a modest, light-colored blouse with a soft cardigan, dark slacks and flat shoes, minimal jewelry, such as small pearl earrings and a delicate necklace, often holding tissues, rose from her seat as her legs carried her into that aisle on instinct and memory, and something that felt like divine appointment. That distance collapsed like it had never existed at all. She wasn't running. Nurses don't run, they've seen too much, carried too much, held together too many broken things to let urgency make them careless. But she was moving with purpose, each step deliberate, her eyes locked on the man in uniform who'd just spoken her name like a prayer. And Marcus, Sergeant Marcus Webb, decorated soldier, trained to stand firm under pressure, looked like he might crumble right there. Steve Harvey didn't move, didn't crack a joke to cut the tension, didn't try to narrate what was happening. He just stepped back, microphone hanging loose at his side, and let the moment breathe. The cameras were still rolling, still catching every second, but somehow it felt like they'd become invisible, like the technology had surrendered to something older, something that couldn't be captured but only witnessed. Patricia stopped 3 feet from Marcus, close enough to see the tears tracking down his face, close enough to see the boy he'd been beneath the man he'd become. "Marcus?" Her voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like light through fog. "Marcus Riley Webb?" He nodded. Couldn't speak, could barely breathe. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, you're alive. You're here. You're..." Her words fractured into sobs, and she closed the distance between them in one step, her arms wrapping around him like she was still that nurse on a night shift 10 years ago, still trying to hold together a broken 19-year-old who couldn't see past his own darkness. Marcus's arms came around her, and his whole body shook. This man who'd stood firm under enemy fire, who'd carried wounded brothers across hostile terrain, who'd learned to lock away his emotions in boxes deep enough that they couldn't interfere with the mission he broke, completely. His head dropped to her shoulder, and the sound that came out of him was raw and ancient and human in a way that reminded everyone watching that soldiers are just people who've seen too much too young. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. I should have found you. I should have—" "Shh." Patricia pulled back just enough to frame his face with her hands. "The way a mother does, the way someone does when they need you to hear them. Not just with your ears, but with your whole soul. You don't apologize for surviving, baby. You don't ever apologize for that." The audience was gone now. Not literally, they were still there in their seats, tissues pressed to faces, hands gripping armrests, strangers holding on to strangers because sometimes you need to touch something real when beauty breaks your heart. But they understood, in that collective, wordless way that humans sometimes do, that they weren't the audience anymore. They were witnesses. There's a difference. Steve Harvey finally moved. He walked slowly across the stage, his steps careful, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of gentleness that doesn't come from media training or teleprompters. It comes from being a father, a grandfather, a man who's lived long enough to know that some moments are holy. "Patricia," Steve said quietly, "did you remember him?" She nodded, tears streaming freely now, not bothering to wipe them away. "I remember them all," she said, her voice thick. "Every single one. But Marcus, yes. I remember Marcus. I remember that night." "Tell me," Steve said. "Not for the camera, not for the show. Just because sometimes stories need to be told, need to be heard, need to exist in the air between people so they can finally stop living only in the dark corners of memory." Patricia took a shaky breath, her hand still resting on Marcus's arm like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. He came into the recovery ward around 11 at night. They'd just cleared him medically, said he was good to return to duty, but— She paused, looked at Marcus with eyes that had seen 1,000 versions of that same story. "But you weren't good, were you, honey?" Marcus shook his head, unable to speak. He was sitting in the hallway. Patricia continued, her voice steadier now, falling into the rhythm of a story she'd probably turned over in her mind more times than she could count. Just sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, staring at nothing, and I'd seen that look before, too many times. It's the look of someone who's standing on the edge of something they can't come back from. The studio had never been quieter. You could hear the hum of the lights overhead. You could hear someone in the back row breathing too fast, crying too hard. You could hear the moment stretching out like time itself had decided to slow down and pay attention. "I sat down next to him," Patricia said. "Didn't say anything at first, just sat there. And after a while he asked me why I was still there, why I wasn't home with my family. And I told him." She smiled through her tears, a sad, knowing smile. "I told him that my son was about his age, that he was deployed too, and that I stayed because if my boy was sitting in some hallway halfway around the world feeling the way Marcus looked like he was feeling, I'd want someone to sit with him too." "Jesus," Steve Harvey whispered. And it wasn't a curse. It was a prayer. "We talked for hours," Patricia continued. "About everything and nothing. About his mama's cooking and baseball and this dog he had growing up named Biscuit. And somewhere around 3 in the morning he looked at me and he said, 'I think I'm going to be okay.' Just like that. 'I think I'm going to be okay.'" She looked at Marcus now, her eyes searching his face. "And I went home that night, and I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed that he was right. That he'd be okay. That he'd find his way." Marcus was openly weeping now, his shoulders shaking, all pretense of military composure abandoned. "I wouldn't be here without you," he managed. "I wouldn't that night. I had a plan. I had it all figured out. But you sat with me. You stayed. And you made me remember that there were still good people in the world. That there were still things worth staying for." Patricia pulled him close again, and this time, when they embraced, it felt less like a reunion and more like a healing. Like two people who'd carried the same story in different directions for a decade were finally able to set it down together. Steve Harvey turned to the audience, and his eyes were wet too. "Y'all see this?" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Y'all see what just happened here?" He shook his head slowly. "This ain't about a game show. This ain't about money or prizes or getting on TV. This is about what we're supposed to do for each other. This is about the smallest act of kindness, sitting with somebody, staying when you could have left, and how it can save a whole life." The applause started slowly. Just one person, then two, then the entire studio, rising to their feet, not in celebration, but in reverence. For Patricia, who'd stayed. For Marcus, who'd survived. For the invisible thread that connects every act of compassion to every life it touches in ways we'll never fully understand. But Steve held up his hand, and the applause faded, because he knew, somehow, that the story wasn't finished yet. "Marcus," Steve said gently, "is that why you came tonight? Just to say thank you?" Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, took a breath that sounded like it came from somewhere deep and painful. "No, sir," he said. "There's more." The air in the studio shifted again. If the silence before had been reverent, this was something else entirely. A kind of collective holding of breath, a sense that whatever was coming next would require something from everyone present. Not just their attention, their hearts. Marcus reached into his uniform pocket, his hands still trembling slightly, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn at the edges, creased from being opened and closed countless times. The kind of thing that's been carried so long it's become part of the person carrying it. "That night," Marcus began, his voice steadier now, but still threaded with emotion. "When you told me about your son, about David, you showed me his picture. You kept it in your badge holder. And you told me he was stationed in Kandahar province, that he was infantry, that he wrote you letters every week without fail." Patricia's hand moved to her chest. Her breathing had changed. "You told me," Marcus continued, "that the hardest part of your job wasn't the long hours or the hard cases. It was going home every night and not knowing if he was safe. Not knowing if someone, somewhere, was taking care of him the way you were taking care of all of us." Steve Harvey's expression had shifted. He was watching Patricia now, and you could see the understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. The cameras had moved closer, instinctively, but somehow they still felt distant, respectful. Like even technology understood the sacredness of what was unfolding. "Miss Coleman," Marcus said, and his voice broke on her name. "Patricia, 3 years after that night, after you saved my life, I was leading a patrol outside of Kandahar. We took fire. Ambush. And one of my guys went down." He paused, swallowed hard. His name was David Coleman. And before the medevac arrived, before they airlifted him out, he grabbed my hand and he said, "If I don't make it, tell my mama I wrote her a letter. Tell her it's in my pocket. Tell her I love her." The sound that came from Patricia wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a cry. It was something in between the sound of a mother's heart, recognizing a truth it had carried in silence for 7 years. "He made it," Marcus said quickly, urgently, seeing the fear flash across her face. "He made it, Patricia. He's alive. He's home. He's okay." Patricia's legs seemed to give out slightly, and Steve Harvey moved without thinking, his hand steadying her elbow, guiding her, holding her up the way you hold up anyone who's just had the ground shift beneath them. "But I never forgot," Marcus pressed on, needing to finish, needing her to hear all of it. "I never forgot that the woman who saved my life was the same woman who gave life to the man I saved. And I carried that with me. Every day. Every mission. This idea that we're all connected in ways we can't see. That your kindness to me came back around to your own son. That somehow, God or the universe or whatever you want to call it, it keeps track, it pays attention." Steve Harvey's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Did you know?" he asked Patricia. "Did you know it was Marcus who saved your son?" She shook her head, tears flowing freely, her whole body trembling. "David told me a sergeant pulled him out, kept him alive until the helicopter came. But he didn't remember the name. The trauma he couldn't remember." She looked at Marcus with something beyond gratitude, beyond relief. It was the look of someone seeing the face of grace itself. "You brought my baby home." "You brought me back first," Marcus said simply. "I was just returning the favor." And there it was. The perfect symmetry of it. The impossible beauty of 2 lives intersecting twice, once in a hospital hallway at 3 in the morning, once in a desert firefight half a world away, and both times, in the space between death and life, choosing to stay, choosing each other. Steve Harvey turned to the audience, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 4 decades in television, 4 decades of laughter and games and bright lights, all of it leading to this moment, right here. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, and the honesty of it, the rawness, was more powerful than any punchline he'd ever delivered. "I've been doing this a long time. I've seen a lot. But this..." He shook his head, looked back at Marcus and Patricia standing together. "This is why we're here. Not for the game, not for the cameras. For this. For the reminder that we need each other, that every kindness matters, that nothing is wasted." The studio had become a sanctuary. People were crying openly now, not bothering to hide it, not embarrassed by their tears. Strangers were holding hands. A man in the front row had his arm around someone he'd never met before tonight. And in the center of it all, Patricia Coleman, a woman in her mid to late 50s with a gentle maternal presence, light to neutral skin tone, soft facial features with fine wrinkles around her eyes, warm hazel or brown eyes, shoulder-length chestnut brown hair with slight gray strands, styled in loose natural waves, wearing a modest light-colored blouse with a soft cardigan, dark slacks and flat shoes, minimal jewelry such as small pearl earrings and a delicate necklace, tears streaming down her face, and Sergeant Marcus Webb, a 32-year-old African-American man with a strong athletic military build, broad shoulders and rigid posture, medium to dark brown skin, a square jawline, deep-set brown eyes, a short military buzz cut, clean-shaven or with minimal stubble, wearing a formal dark dress, military uniform with shoulder epaulettes, name tag, Webb, visible rank insignia and ribbon bars, black belt, and polished black combat boots, stood together, 2 people who'd saved each other without knowing it, who'd carried each other's story for years without understanding the full weight of what they'd been carrying. Patricia reached up and cupped Marcus's face again, the way she might have done with her own son. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him home. Thank you for staying alive. Thank you for being here." "Thank you for seeing me," Marcus whispered back. "For sitting with me. For staying when everyone else left." They held each other again, and this time there was no urgency in it. Just peace. Just the quiet understanding that some debts can never be repaid because they were never debts to begin with. They were gifts. Acts of love disguised as coincidence, as duty, as simply being in the right place at the right time with the right heart. Steve Harvey let the moment breathe. Didn't rush it. Didn't fill the silence with words. He just stood there. This man who'd made millions laugh, letting the tears on his own face speak for him. And when he finally did speak, it was soft, almost to himself. "Sometimes," he said, "television doesn't just entertain. Sometimes it bears witness. And tonight, we all got to witness something that reminds us what we're capable of. What love looks like when it comes full circle." The applause came again, but different this time. Slower, deeper. The kind that's not about celebration but about agreement. About a room full of people saying, "Yes, this matters, this is real, this is what we're supposed to remember when the lights go out and the cameras stop rolling. This is what it means to be human." The game show never finished that night. The questions went unasked, the points uncounted, the prize money secondary to something that couldn't be measured in dollars or points or studio audience applause. When the cameras finally stopped rolling an hour later than scheduled, after Steve Harvey had invited both Marcus and Patricia to sit on stage, after they'd talked and cried and laughed in that way, people do when grief and joy occupy the same space, the crew stood in silence. No one rushed to pack up equipment. No one checked their phones or complained about overtime. They just stood there, aware they'd been part of something that transcended the usual machinery of television. But the story didn't end when the studio lights dimmed. It spread the way truth always does, quietly at first, then gathering momentum like water finding its course. The footage aired 3 weeks later, unedited except for time, every tear and trembling word intact. Within hours, it had been shared 1 million times. Then, 10 million. Not because it was shocking or scandalous, or designed to go viral, but because it was real. Because in a world that had grown cynical and fractured and exhausted by performed emotion, Here was something that couldn't be faked. Here was proof that goodness still existed, that kindness still mattered, that the smallest act of staying, just staying, could echo across years and miles and circumstances in ways that defied explanation. Patricia Coleman received 7,000 letters in the first month alone, from nurses who'd worked night shifts and wondered if they'd made a difference, from soldiers who'd been where Marcus had been, standing on that edge, who wanted her to know that someone had stayed with them too, from mothers with sons overseas who wept watching her face when she realized what Marcus had done. The letters came from every state, from countries she'd never visited, written in languages she couldn't read but understood perfectly, because gratitude sounds the same in every tongue. Marcus started speaking at veteran centers. Not because he wanted attention, he'd never wanted that, but because Patricia asked him to. They need to hear it from you. She'd told him over coffee 2 weeks after the show aired, in a small diner where they'd started meeting every Thursday morning. They need to know that the darkness doesn't win, that getting help isn't weakness, that staying is always, always worth it. So he went, and he told his story. And he watched young men and women with that same look he'd once worn, that hollow, exhausted, can't do this anymore look, begin to let light back in. David Coleman flew in from Oregon for Thanksgiving that year. He'd watched the episode 7 times, his wife told Patricia, crying harder each time. The first time he and Marcus met face to face, in Patricia's living room with the autumn light coming through the windows, they didn't say much, just shook hands that turned into an embrace, that turned into 2 men standing in a stranger's living room, holding each other and weeping for all the things they'd survived and all the grace that had carried them through. Steve Harvey kept a photo on his desk. Just one. Not from his biggest shows or his most famous moments, but from that night. Marcus and Patricia on stage, foreheads touching, Steve's hand on both their shoulders. He looked at it on hard days, on days when the industry felt shallow and the work felt meaningless. It reminded him why he'd started all this in the first place. Not for ratings, not for money, for the rare, precious moments when television stops being entertainment and becomes a mirror showing us the best of what we can be. The ripples kept spreading. A hospital in Seattle started a program pairing retired nurses with recovering veterans. A teacher in Maine used the story in her classroom, talking to teenagers about the power of presence, about how showing up for someone really showing up might be the most important thing any of us ever do. A father in Tennessee, who'd been planning to leave his family, watched the episode and stayed. Just stayed. Worked on his marriage, got help, chose to be present for his kids. He wrote to the show, "I realize that staying is a choice we make every day, and it's the most important one." 2 years later, Marcus and Patricia walked together in a Veterans Day parade. Not as strangers brought together by chance, but as family, because that's what they'd become, mother and son in every way that mattered. Bound not by blood, but by the deeper truth that we save each other, over and over, in ways we'll never fully understand. And somewhere, on a night when someone felt alone and hopeless and certain that the world had forgotten them, they stumbled across a video, a game show that stopped being a game show, a soldier and a nurse, a moment of impossible grace, and they watched it through to the end, tears streaming down their face, and they thought, maybe I'll stay. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe I matter more than I know. Sometimes, one voice from a crowd is all it takes. Sometimes, 4 hours in a hospital hallway can save 2 lives instead of 1. Sometimes, the cameras are rolling at exactly the right moment to capture exactly the right truth. And sometimes, television doesn't just entertain, it reminds us why we're still here, why we still believe in each other, why love, in the end, is the only thing that wins.